Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Cybersecurity for Retirement Plans. I have just a few announcements for those of you who are requesting credit. Please note that to receive CE credit, you must remain logged into the video portion of the webinar for the entire program. Logging in to the audio portion only is not sufficient for CE credit. Continuing education credits are being offered for the following designations: CPE, CIMA, CPWA, CIMC, RMA, CFP, and SHRM. Also, at the end of the webinar, we would like to request that all attendees fill out the evaluation form that will pop up. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the question box. At the end of the webinar, we'll answer as many questions as we can, but we want to be respectful of your schedule and end on time. If we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you afterwards. Tomorrow, you'll receive an email with a link to replay today's broadcast. Let's get started. We're joined today by Kate Blake, Instructional Designer and Technology Trainer at Pentegra. Kate has been with us since the beginning of her career, where she started in the retirement benefits field. And being the quick learner and talented contributor she is, Kate quickly arose into various positions within Pentegra. Kate's been able to exemplify her deep roots of industry experience in each position she's held, and her skills have always been the perfect complement to Pentegra's culture. Kate, I'll turn this over to you to start talking about cybersecurity for retirement plans.
Great. Thank you so much, Noelle, and thank you everybody for taking the time out of your schedules to join us today. We were joking beforehand that, I wasn't sure how many people exactly were going to tune in to learn about cybersecurity on an afternoon in July, but I think that this is a great time to get your CE credits in, because nobody wants to be at the end of a credit cycle without having what they need. So thanks for tuning in, and we're happy to help you all get those CE credits in. We do have a few other learning objectives today as well. We're going to take a look at the latest guidance on cybersecurity for qualified retirement plans. We will talk about the tips for hiring a plan service provider. This is part of some recent guidance that has come out, along with cybersecurity program best practices for qualified retirement plans. And then we'll also take a look at the role of the financial advisor in cybersecurity. So in addition to getting those CE credits today, it is always one of my primary goals to make this theoretical and legalese information actionable for you all as professionals in the industry. We all want to help our clients through this, maze of a topic. So let's talk about ways in which we can do that today. Okay. So there was a fella, his name was Willie Sutton. In the 1920s and 1930s, he was a bank robber. And when he finally got caught, he was alleged to have been asked by a reporter, "Why'd you do it, Willie?" And he said, in a rather tongue-in-cheek way, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, "Because that's where the money is." And while he later denied saying that, this quote is actually something that later morphed into something called Sutton's Law, which is a med school teaching that says that when diagnosing, consider the obvious. So what does a med school saying and 1920s bank robber have in common? And what do they have to do with retirement plans? Well, we should be considering the obvious too. And at the end of the second quarter of 2022, retirement plan assets totaled $33.7 trillion. This is a growing industry, and it is increasingly impacted by technology. According to the Identity Theft Resource Center's 2021 data breach report, there were 1,862 breaches in 2021. This surpassed 2020's total of 1,108. And both of those years also surpassed the previous record, which was 1,506 breaches in 2015. So assets are increasing, breaches are also increasing. What this is doing is it is making retirement plans a target. When I say because that's where the money is, and it's pretty easy on this slide, what I really mean is The lack of cybersecurity protocol with respect to retirement plans turns retirement plans into essentially a target for cyber criminals. So let's spend a couple minutes first talking about why this is the case, and then we'll go into an overview of the current guidance that we have today. So for better or worse, I think we'll all agree that the retirement plan industry is a disparate industry of large and small providers, large and small employers. They all have different degrees of capabilities and wherewithal and the ability, differing abilities to invest, as you can see here on the slide, the necessary technical and system resources to help safeguard these assets. Another area of weakness that's sort of implied on this slide, but not explicitly stated, is just the number of players in the industry. And by that I mean plan sponsors, payroll providers, custodians, record keepers, TPAs, and then, of course, the participants and beneficiaries themselves. So with all these players, all these assets, and all this change, what sort of guidance do we have today? Let's take a look. There's a DOL regulation out there that covers electronic delivery regulations, which stipulates that a plan sponsor must ensure the electronic system it uses keeps participants' personal information relating to their accounts and beneficiaries confidential. That said, there is no comprehensive cybersecurity protocol for retirement plan administrators at the federal level, but many states have laws in practice for business owners. So my take on all of this is we have the basics over here where, we have a responsibility to ensure that we keep information personal, but we don't have any formalized guidance, but instead a patchwork of state guidance. So it's a start, but none of it comes right out and says that it's a fiduciary responsibility of plan sponsors to have cybersecurity measures in place. And I think we would all agree that that statement is something that we need to be working towards as practitioners in the industry. And the fact that there is no comprehensive cybersecurity protocol at the federal level makes it more challenging for us to ensure that our plan sponsors and partners that we work with, who may be across the country in all 50 states, are doing something and are doing the right thing. So right now, again, this DOL reg is one piece of the puzzle that we have out here. And this is critical. We have seen legislation pop up around the storage of participants' personal information, and we are only going to continue to see more of this in the future. Let me give you a recent example of Bartnet versus Abbott Labs from 2020. So in this example, $245,000 was stolen from a former employee account by a cyber thief. The thief got access to this participant's social security number and got access to their email account. The plaintiff alleged that the defendants failed to enforce a security question, when they called customer service, and instead provided a one-time code over the phone, among some other issues. The court found the plan sponsor not liable, but did find that the record keeper failed to protect Bartnett's personal information and property and properly notify her of important changes to her account. In the end, this participant was able to recover $108,845 of the stolen funds. Initially, she rejected a take it or leave it offer from Abbott that restored only a fraction of the stolen funds, and instead sued both the benefits administrator and Abbott plan fiduciaries, which is how we ended up with this example today. There are a lot of downstream impacts to things like this. Of course, it takes money and manpower and resources to handle this at the employer level when things like this crop up, but there's also reputational damage at play. And providing our sponsors and partners with the guidance they need to prevent these issues from occurring can be a tremendous value add to retirement plans. So we can see how the current guidance that we have starts to lay the groundwork, but it still leaves the door open with more questions. We see this reflected in a February 2021 report from the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, where they recommended that the DOL formally state whether or not it's a fiduciary's responsibility to mitigate cybersecurity risks in DC plans, and to establish minimum expectations for addressing cybersecurity risks in those plans. But despite these directives, this was a little over 3 years ago at this point that the GAO put this out, we still do not have a comprehensive policy. That said, we do have some additional guidance from the DOL. So let's take a couple of moments and review these 3 pieces that were published in 2021, which are kind of colloquially referred to as the DOL's 3 points of light. One is the tips for hiring a service provider. This document is intended to help plan sponsors and fiduciaries prudently select a service provider with strong cybersecurity practices and monitor their activities. The second one is the Cybersecurity Program Best Practices document, which assists fiduciaries and record keepers in their responsibilities to manage cybersecurity risks with a 12-step process. And then the third document is the Online Security Tips document. And this is actually intended to be for plan participants and beneficiaries. So we've got 3 documents out here. What we'll do over the next couple minutes is we'll take a look at these 3 documents in a little bit more detail. But before we do, it's time for our first poll question. So just to recap, let's talk about the framework today. As it relates to cybersecurity, the DOL's current policy, A, has specific rules and regs for plan sponsors to follow. B, doesn't require sponsors to have formal policies. C, has guidelines for sponsors to follow its best practices. Or D, both B and C.
The polling question should now appear on your screen. The poll is now closed. The correct answer was D.
Thanks so much, Noelle. Yep. So again, we don't have specific rules and regs for plan sponsors to follow, and that is what the problem is. We have, this guidance, and we have best practices, but we don't have any comprehensive federal policy, as we said. So let's take a look now at these 3 documents in more detail. We'll start with a look at the tips for hiring a service provider document. Just keep in mind as we go into the details here that plan sponsors do have a fiduciary responsibility to prudently select and monitor all of their plan service providers. But the purpose of this document is to help sponsors and fiduciaries prudently select a service provider that has strong cybersecurity practices in place. And we'll talk about what those practices are and what we need to be looking out for in just a moment. This information complements the DOL's regs on electronic records and disclosures to plan participants and beneficiaries. So that other reg that we talked about before that says that we have to safeguard this stuff but doesn't really describe how, this document expands on that a little bit. So it includes provisions on ensuring things like electronic record-keeping systems have reasonable controls, adequate records management practices are in place, and also that electronic disclosure systems include measures calculated to protect PII, which of course is personally identifiable information. Let's talk in a little bit more detail about some of these policies. So you can see on this graphic here, it's all about documentation. And the DOL is starting to ask for this type of documentation and audits. So this is one area where we as practitioners can add value to our clients by helping them document what, again, can be a complicated map of cybersecurity policies. So we want to make sure we document all these items: information security standards, practices, policies, and procedures, audit results. Take our audit results and make sure we're benchmarking them to some reasonableness standard. We want to make sure that we document security provider validation practices. That is exactly what we were talking about in the Abbott Labs case, where they gave them the one-time code and that criminal was able to steal over $200,000. Security levels and standards. So who can access what data? Implementation processes and procedures. And who can access data during, say, transitions in, transitions out of data. Look at their history for all of the vendors that a plan sponsor may work with. What is the track record of those service providers? Have there been any security incidents, litigation, and legal proceedings? And what remedies has the service provider been involved in? Now, for many years, I served as a consultant to plan sponsors, and I would periodically meet with them, and we would talk about many different complicated retirement plan subjects, cybersecurity being one of them. And the biggest thing I used to always see with employers and plan sponsors was that when you provide them with a long checklist of technical information, their eyes tend to either glaze over or go into a deer in headlights look. So, maybe one way that we can add value is by helping gather these documents and maybe helping proactively create a file. And instead of just dumping this information on plan sponsors without any additional context, maybe you present it in a conversation in a way that's done here, where, if we look at this a little bit more closely, we can kind of see that these items fall into three broad categories. This is going to be policies, audits, and benchmarks. This is going to be the protocols that we have in place. And this is going to be track record and what we've done about it. So again, sometimes I think when we can take these really long lists of, multiple bullet points and just distill them into, as we did here, three broad categories we should be thinking about that can help our plan sponsors get into the right mindset to start tracking this stuff, because I really don't think most of them are tracking it adequately today. I think we have covered many of these, but just a couple other ancillary takeaways from that document. We talked about the past security breaches and remedies. Review the insurance contract. Also document service provider insurance policies that would cover losses. I know that many vendors out there today have policies in place, so just make sure that you obtain those and store those as part of your due diligence. Also, make sure you document any specific contractual language or cybersecurity red flags. There are just certain things that we all should be using today. MFA is one of them. If a provider does not have that, is that a red flag? Maybe we just want to ask the provider, why aren't you using that, and help a plan sponsor document it. Red flags don't necessarily have to be disqualifying, but they certainly should be things that we look into and document. Also, make sure that we document vendors' information security standards and limitations on any provider or vendor's liability. The long and short of it is, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Get it reviewed and translated. And what I mean by that is make sure you have someone who is familiar with cybersecurity practices to help you review the material. Remember, again, ERISA's prudent expert standard for plan fiduciaries. A lot of times Especially at smaller employers, I typically see HR or finance folks taking the lead role on retirement plans and retirement plan committees. That's all well and good, but maybe this is an opportunity where you bring in, a cybersecurity expert, somebody from an IT team within the organization, or again, just somebody who is a little bit more familiar with the material to make sure that the protocols in place are properly implemented and followed. Okay, I mentioned this earlier, but DOL investigations have begun. So the DOL is already checking the cybersecurity procedures of plans that are currently under audit. They're asking for an extensive list of documentation. I'll rattle off some items to you later, and we'll talk about how we can, again, make sure that we're helping plan sponsors have what they need available just in case. Plan sponsors may need to consult with service providers to obtain all the documents requested. That can be laborious, but again, if we take that proactive role, we can help clients maybe store those documents in a file with their records for the retirement plan so that they have them handy and documented already. If an employer plan sponsor is not able to produce the requested documents, that would be an exception, and they must specify the reasons why the documents are unavailable. Now, when I say a long list of documentation, I mean a long list of documentation. So I'm going to rattle off some things to you. Don't feel like you have to furiously scribble all of these down. This presentation is being recorded, so you can always access this later, because what you might want to do is create a handy dandy little checklist for your clients or partners that they can use to make sure that they're meeting all these parameters. So the DOL could ask for things like policies, procedures, or guidelines related to data governance, classification, data disposal, the implementation of access controls and identity management, including things like, as we said before, MFA, business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response processes, security risk assessments, data privacy policies, management of vendors and third-party service providers, so your vendor management policies as a plan sponsor, cybersecurity awareness training, sensitive information encryption policies, documents and communications related to past cybersecurity incidents, security control audit reports, descriptions of technical controls like firewalls. I typically tend to tell plan sponsors, create little folders for important things related to your retirement plan. Maybe you have a little electronic folder for things relating to the plan document, and maybe that's where the sponsor stores the executed documents. Maybe you have another folder for a plan sponsor that has the annual review documentation. And if you're talking with a plan sponsor and they haven't considered cybersecurity and you tell them all of this and their head's spinning and they don't know where to get started, maybe if they just create a folder somewhere and they start, over time, gathering this material and putting it in that folder, that is such a great start. And I think even just those baby steps probably put them far and away above many other retirement plan sponsors who have yet to even consider these topics. So, practical and tactical actions for plan sponsors. What can we do to help? Ensure the safe and secure transport of employee deferrals from payroll provider to record keeper. This ties in with what we said before about just there's a lot of different cooks in the kitchen here. This never necessarily means that somebody is doing something wrong or has a bad policy, but we have to document it for cybersecurity purposes. So again, if we're telling all of this to a client and their head is spinning, maybe we could offer to send a letter to their payroll provider on their behalf, requesting their processes, procedures, and remediations. And then once we get it, they could pop it in their folder. We also want to help ensure participants have adequate information to mitigate potential breaches. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment, but in general, that's just incorporating general cybersecurity best practices into our financial wellness offerings. Most employers these days do things like the phishing tests and cybersecurity awareness videos and programs, things like that go a long way. Document the record keeper's processes, policies, procedures, and remediations requests. Keep them in writing from the record keeper. This too is another area where we can help just with vendor management and due diligence. Sometimes we might meet with a plan sponsor who has a legacy plan from, 40 years ago, and they have a super old vendor, or maybe they have acquired a bunch of companies and there's a number of different record keepers in play. In those situations, again, we can be of assistance by communicating with the record keeper firm and asking for these policies. And again, popping it into that file. We can do it a little bit at a time. I said earlier, I thought that this is actually a great time in the middle of the summer when things are quiet to work on getting our CE credits. Maybe this is a great time to start a project like this when our heads aren't spinning with a Form 5500 deadline or census data collection or notices. The summertime could be a good time to, start planting these idea seeds in clients' heads. Okay, it is now time for our second poll question. Plan sponsors should request documentation from which service providers regarding policies, procedures, and cyber breaches? The payroll provider, the record keeper, their plan advisor, or all of the above?
The polling question should now appear on your screen. The poll will be available for another few seconds for anyone who has yet to select an answer. Okay, the poll is now closed. The correct answer was D.
Great. Thank you so much, Noelle. And just to recap again, that concludes our discussion of the first of the three pieces of DOL guidance, being the document called the Tips for Hiring the Service Provider. These three documents are available on the DOL's website. So these could also be great accompaniments to these discussions. If you happen to be meeting with a plan sponsor, you could download that document and have it available to help facilitate the discussion, because it does discuss all of the topics that we just covered here. And it could be a great takeaway for them just to keep for their reference. Okay. The next document that we're going to look at is the Cybersecurity Program Best Practices piece. The purpose of this is to aid record keepers and other plan service providers. So the first document is, I'm a plan sponsor, how do I select a vendor? The second document is, maybe I'm a vendor, how do I make sure I have the best practices in place? And that's what we'll talk about now. So you can see here, this is the document that I mentioned earlier that has 12 steps in a plan meant to assist plan fiduciaries and record keepers in their responsibilities to manage cybersecurity risks. So let's take a look at those 12 steps. I have them outlined here. Again, you will get a copy of this recording tomorrow. So this too could just be a great, either, maybe you download the Cybersecurity Program Best Practices document from the DOL's website and get the 12 steps that way. Or maybe you can take these 12 steps and make it, as we said before, into a nice little checklist for clients. But there's lots of ways that you can turn this guidance into an actionable conversation between you and your clients. So we want to make sure that we have a formal, well-documented cybersecurity program. We talked just a moment ago about all those different documents that the DOL might ask for. That's what we're talking about here. How do we store those documents? What do we need to store? How often do we need to audit those documents? What benchmarks are in place when we're looking at our program? Things of that nature. We want to make sure that we conduct prudent annual risk assessments. We mentioned earlier, one of the Well, I think I actually, I mentioned it earlier that uh, we want to take a look at each sponsor individually. So, what are your specific relationships? What vendors do you have in place? Do you have, maybe a separate record keeper? Is there a separate payroll provider? Who is the TPA? Each one of those vendors is going to have a different policy, going to be comfortable with taking a different level of risk, and it's up to us as partners to plan sponsors to make sure that they're able to gather all of that information, digest it, and understand it against their own needs. We mentioned number 3 earlier, but have a reliable third-party audit of security controls. I know we at Pentegra engage with an external firm who audits our controls. Clearly define and assign information security roles and responsibilities. You may have clients who have larger IT staffs, or you may have vendors who have larger or smaller IT staffs. Some may have dedicated cybersecurity officers. Some may have vendor management representatives who can help you obtain documents and things like that. We also want to make sure that in addition to understanding the structure and staffing with vendors that we work with, that we understand it for our clients. So make sure that they have appointed somebody to handle cybersecurity issues or, general technology questions. But just in general, knowing who does what for both the employer, plan sponsor, and the vendors is key. And, especially you'll want to make sure that you have those conversations when it is a low stakes situation before an error occurs. We never want to find ourselves in a situation where something happens with one of the record keepers we work with and we don't know who their cybersecurity officer is, and a participant calls us, frantic, not sure what to do, and we're, ringing around the phone tree. We want to make sure that we have all that information laid out in advance. Have strong access control procedures. This, I think, is just such a critical point and so important to make sure that vendors have in the era of acquisitions. We have seen so many vendors acquire other firms over the years. And I think any of us who have ever participated in an acquisition knows, legacy systems come over. Sometimes data gets transferred, sometimes it doesn't get transferred. And it's important to know who has access to what data and what information. Ensure that any assets or data stored in the cloud or managed by a third-party service provider are subject to appropriate security reviews and independent security assessments. This is becoming more important as many vendors are moving to cloud services. I know this is another example of something that we at Pentegra did earlier this year. So that changed our cybersecurity protocols. Conduct periodic cybersecurity awareness trainings. I think most employers are doing this, but if you have any employers who are smaller plan sponsors and they're not yet doing it, it's certainly something to recommend. Number 8, implement and manage a secure system development lifecycle system to make sure, again, that our parameters are clearly laid out, tracked, and only people who are intended to have access to this data have access to it. Have an effective business resiliency program addressing business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response. I used to be on our disaster recovery team, and each year we would do a disaster recovery exercise where we'd fail over to our backup servers and test different types of programs and services just to make sure that everything still works. And I used to think to myself, oh, we'll never need to use these disaster recovery procedures. And then, of course, in 2020, COVID happened, which is a great example of why those procedures are so important. And I think at Pentegra, us having those procedures in advance, clearly laid out, already testing and auditing them annually was critical to our response and being able to immediately go remote for everybody during COVID. Encrypt sensitive data that is stored and in transit. Make sure that any plan sponsors that you work with are no longer sending sensitive information via email. This is one of the things I would say, number 10, that is probably the most easily preventable, but probably one of the most common things that I still tend to see. Again, especially with our smaller employers where we may have a limited HR staff wearing multiple hats, I really do still see SSNs coming through in email way more than we should. So it's always good to just give those friendly reminders to clients who may not be reminded of that on a daily basis. 11 is implement strong technical controls in accordance with best security practices. You can have all of the best practices laid out in the world, but if you don't have the technical controls to go with them, they are meaningless. So this is going to be, for an example of somebody who has a cybersecurity officer and an IT help desk, like we do at Pentegra, we need to make sure that our cybersecurity folks and our help desk folks are synced up on parameters. I see that frequently too with large TPAs and record keepers. They will have more segmented IT departments. So, again, you can ask for their cybersecurity technical controls and policies as part of vendor management. And of course, appropriately respond to any past cybersecurity incidents. I think that goes without saying, but you would be shocked how sometimes, again, if you're a smaller employer, you simply may not know what constitutes a cybersecurity incident. Some people simply do not know that sending, an unmasked email or an unmasked SSN via email is divulging PII. So making sure that the employers that we work with are training their staff on these policies is really mission critical here. This is a document that might be worth downloading and bringing to an annual review meeting. This and the first one that we just looked at, and going through both of them. How to select and then the things to ask for and look at once you have selected is essentially what we're looking at here. But again, the bottom line here, get it all in writing. We said it earlier, document it. If you don't document it in the eyes of the DOL, it simply did not happen. Okay. It's now time for our next polling question. This one is a true or false question. Plan sponsors should require written policies and insurance contracts from their service providers regarding cybersecurity.
The polling question should now appear on your screen. This poll will be available for another few seconds for anyone who has yet to select an answer. Okay, the poll is now closed. The correct answer was A. Kate, you may continue.
Great. Thank you so much, Noelle. Yep, this is, again, just an echoing of everything that we've been saying so far. We've got to get all policies, all contracts, including insurance contracts from all service providers that plan sponsors work with. Make sure that we store them somewhere, make sure that we periodically review them, because again, the DOL is auditing and they do reserve the right to now ask for these documents. All right, so the first two documents were geared towards plan sponsors and service providers. Those are the documents, again, that I would bring to my annual review meeting, excuse me, and are critical to a discussion of vendor management. But I would say an equally important side of the equation is represented in this third document that we're about to look at. which is the cybersecurity best practices piece from the DOL, which is for plan participants. According to an IBM study, 95% of breaches occur due to human error in data handling, which is a pretty scary thing to think about. But again, I mean, we have covered so many examples of where that can occur just today. The unmasked SSN being sent, someone using sketchy Wi-Fi that they shouldn't be using and logging onto a corporate portal or onto their website, acquiring a company and having legacy systems that aren't protected, making sure a call center is, enforcing security standards instead of just giving out one-time access codes over the phone, which, as we saw earlier, was the key component in leading to a lawsuit and, again, to potential reputational damage for an organization. So all of these things have one thing in common. They're caused by people. So this third document is intended really for the people who these plans are for, who work with this, their accounts online on a regular basis, but who may not fully be aware of the basic rules to reduce the risk of fraud or loss. So when can we use this document? If you ever do maybe an employee education meeting, this is a great time to share it. I really these days recommend making cybersecurity be, a dedicated topic in employee education meetings because it is just so critical. Maybe you could print it off or have an employer print it off and hand out copies to plan participants at, benefit fair, or make them available in the office kitchen or something like that. But I think it's really critical that we work to get this information out to plan participants, because I didn't say this earlier, but coming back to that opening slide of, why did the bank robber go rob the banks? Because that's where the money is. It's the same thing of this Sutton's Law. Look for the obvious. What are cyber criminals going to target? They're going to target the weakest link. What's the weakest link? I mean, it's probably Grandma Sue's niece who's got a copy of her logon ID and password hanging on her fridge somewhere, as beneficiary to a plan. So many of these things are so avoidable if we can just break that barrier and get through to plan participants. Okay, so now I'm going to get off my soapbox about human error in technology. Let's now talk specifically about what are these tips for participants. Register, set up, and routinely monitor your online account. I think these days a lot of plans are using automatic enrollment. So what that can mean is that when somebody is hired, their data is transmitted to a record keeper and ultimately a TPA firm, and an account is created for them. But I think we all know just how many people never log in to access that account. I used to do employee education meetings. I'd hear it all the time. I think I got auto-enrolled, but I'm not really sure. That, coming back to this idea of the weakest link, I mean, an account that has been created but never accessed, that somebody is kind of lukewarm about to begin with, that is a weak link for a cyber criminal. So even if somebody is not super interested in a 401k, maybe they just say, I just want to let the default ride, I don't know anything about investments, it's important just to set up the account. Just get your MFA set up just for cybersecurity reasons. This is not specifically the focus of today's presentation, but it's tangentially related, so I will mention it. Additionally, if you have a plan structure like that where where auto enrollment is used, typically one of the things they'll ask you for during that setup process is beneficiary information. So it's just another weak link where a cyber criminal could get in. If you've never logged into this account, what's to stop somebody from logging in and naming themselves as beneficiary? Not much if you don't pay attention to it. So the routinely monitor part is important as well. Sometimes I get the feedback from participants, oh, well, I don't want to routinely monitor it because it's too stressful for me. And in response to that, I usually say, do a once a year or once a quarter check-in, make it a New Year's thing or a back to school thing or whatever. You don't have to dive in too deeply, but just reset that password, as we'll talk about next, and just make sure that everything's still up to date. So speaking of passwords, strong and unique passwords are important. And I think that this is all stuff that we know in theory. But again, I think the participant level is where it can go a bit awry. There's just so many examples. I gave the example of the elderly lady giving their login credentials to a beneficiary. But what about a quadro, where now an ex-spouse has an account set up and maybe they never access it. Again, so many access informations and people who have this information, both plan participants, beneficiaries, alternate payees. It's floating around out there. So we need to make sure that not only do we have strong and unique passwords, but that we are changing those passwords regularly. I think that most record keepers require MFA these days, but you should always use it if it's not required. Keep personal contact information current. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen cases where folks have gotten divorced and not updated the beneficiary information in their accounts. That's not necessarily, a cyber crime, but it is critically important to keep that information up to date because it is going to determine how the benefits are paid out. And additionally, if you do get divorced and if your ex-spouse is the contact person on your account, that's just maybe not what you want. Close or delete unused accounts. How many of us have seen somebody who's just a hair over that cash out limit and they go somewhere else and they just leave a string of accounts behind them? And then you finally meet with them one day and they say, oh, I have 5 accounts from prior employers and I don't even know where they are anymore. Another weak link. Be wary of free Wi-Fi. Again, I think we as retirement plan practitioners probably know this, but all you have to do is go down to Starbucks and see how many people may not know it. So it's always worth reiterating to those plan participants and beneficiaries. Beware of phishing attacks. And to that, I will say most of us work with a couple, record keepers on a regular basis. Just get familiar with what their email format looks like. Email formats are usually pretty consistent. So sometimes people will throw away good things because they think they're spam. So just getting our plan participants accustomed to this is the type of information we will email it to you, and this is what it will look like. And this is the type of information that we will not email to you, and this is what it will look like. Antivirus software and keep apps and software current. For most of us as corporate employees, we have corporate issued devices, but again, we have retired participants and beneficiaries collecting these benefits who some of them may not even be physically able to keep their computer up to date. So finding a way or a person or a method to make sure that that information is communicated to them is critical. That's what this document is intended to do. And lastly, just know how to report identity theft and cybersecurity incidents. The document gives further information and resources for that. So this is more of a, again, print out and bring to a meeting and maybe an employee brings home and sticks on their fridge kind of thing. And it's not just beneficial for retirement plans. I think we'll all agree these recommendations are useful across the board. So it really is a favor, I believe, to participants to educate them on these topics. Okay, so that covers the DOL's 3 points of light. Now remember, none of this is what I would describe as concrete federal regulation. All of this is just simply guidance. But that being said, the DOL still is enforcing this guidance and asking for these documents in audit situations. So even though it's not federal legislation, we just simply want to make sure that our vendors, plan sponsors, and partners that we work with are all aware of these 3 documents and have reviewed them. So with that said, let's segue the discussion. How can we help all of these people, all these cooks in the kitchen that we work with, get up to speed on what's happening? How can we add value here? I think embracing this chief governance officer role is a great mindset to take. So the idea here is that a chief governance officer is the person identified to coordinate and oversee the plan's governance process and service providers. That's all that minutia that we were just looking at, the stuff that makes plan sponsors' heads spin, especially in an industry that is hyper competitive and consolidating these days. It's so important for us as service providers to find ways to show value and differentiate ourselves from the pack. So doing something like assisting and gathering written documentation from payroll providers and retirement plan service providers is super boring for us, but that's exactly the point. We're taking that burden off of our clients' plates, and we're making complex topics easier for them to understand. We can help them understand what their cybersecurity policies, procedures, best practices, and safeguards are, as well as the restitution processes in case of a breach. We can help them understand if their vendors have dedicated cybersecurity resources and how much as organizations they've invested in cybersecurity. Education, we just talked about this, is absolutely critical. We want to make sure that we support financial wellness programs for our employees that incorporate cybersecurity best practices. So again, when I did employee education, it was always just the standard, how do you enroll? Here's your plan investments. Here's how you access the website. It's probably been about 10 years since I've done those meetings. If I was doing them today, right after the here's how you access your website, I'd have at least a slide on cybersecurity best practices. And of course, don't forget to document your educational efforts. If you do a meeting, document the dates, stick the presentation in a file, just in case the DOL does ask about our participant education efforts. We can customize a strategy for the employers that we work with, taking into consideration their resources, integration with technology, the cost that they're willing to, invest, cyber insurance, and things like that. We can also, we haven't talked about this one yet, but this is important. We can help demystify contracts with service providers. Now this, in my mind, is really taking it to the next level. So the basics, make sure everybody's got those 3 documents. Make sure we follow the protocol outlined in the documents, including collecting all this information. Stick it in our file. But once it's in the file, this is a great next step. You could be a plan sponsor and you could have done all your due diligence in the world relating to social security or to cybersecurity, and you could have a detailed folder with all these documents, but if you don't understand them, it's not going to get you very far. So once we get all these documents and we get them organized, maybe next year at our annual plan review meeting, we just meter it out little by little, this knowledge and education. Maybe next year we talk about, well, let's look at those contracts. What obligations are in them? What sort of reporting and responsibilities do these vendors have? What sort of risk assessments are they doing? We are the experts at reading this information. So when we put ourselves out there as resources for clients, it makes them that much more inclined to want to use our services. And also that much more inclined to want to follow these best practices and keep their plans in good order. We can also provide advisory services as to whether cybersecurity insurance is needed. We can help employers understand overall insurance programs covering plans and service providers. We can help them evaluate whether cybersecurity insurance has a role in their cyber risk management strategy. And we can help them consider the need for first-party coverage. Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. Let's make sure that we get our last quiz completed here so that everybody can get their CE credits. So for our final quiz question, which of the following is a cybersecurity best practice? A, have a formal, well-documented cybersecurity program. B, conduct prudent annual risk assessments. C, have a reliable annual third-party audit of security controls. Or D, all of the above.
The polling question should now appear on your screen. This poll will be available for another few seconds for anyone who has yet to select an answer. Okay, the poll is now closed. The correct answer was D. Kate, you may continue.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, all the above. Make sure that program's in place, but don't just stop there. Make sure that we do annual risk assessments to follow it up, and make sure that we have a reliable annual third-party audit of security controls. In an era where technology is changing so rapidly, I don't think personally that there is such a thing as overkill when it comes to protecting our information security, personally. So with that in mind, let's just recap a couple of important takeaways here. So as we said, the DOL does require that plan sponsors ensure that the electronic systems they use for plan administration keep participants' personal information confidential. But that said, no comprehensive cybersecurity protocol for retirement plan administration exists at the federal level at this time. As we said before, back in 2021, the GAO did recommend that this type of regulation be implemented, but we have not seen any developments on that front just yet. In the absence of the formal federal regulations, we have a patchwork of state guidelines, and then we also have those 3 points of light from the DOL with the 3 specific documents. So document 1 being for plan sponsors, document 2 being for the vendors and vendor management, and then document 3 being for the plan participants. So we want to make sure that everybody, all those cooks in the kitchen that we work with are familiar with those 3 documents and have reviewed them accordingly, depending on their specific role. And we can, while we're doing that, play a critical role in supporting plan sponsor clients in this new area of concern. We want to make sure we protect against the onslaught of the modern day Willie Sutton. There are certainly a lot of weak links at play out there. Things are changing on the daily, but we have the power here, we have the resources, and we have the ability to make sure that the people that we work with, our clients and partners, are as well equipped as we possibly can be to keep all of our assets safe for ourselves and our participants. So with that said, Noelle, I will turn it back to you to close us out.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks everyone who attended today's webinar. Any questions we did not get to today, we will follow up with you separately. And as a reminder, please complete the survey questions that will pop up on your screen in just a minute. Everyone have a great rest of your day.